On the morning of October 6, 1927, in Cincinnati's Eden Park, a woman screamed as she lost her life. The killer held a shotgun with a cold smile on his face. What if I told you that this killer defended himself in the courtroom and told the jury, "I am George Remus. George Remus killed George Remus"? The truth behind this story is an incredible tale of revenge about how America's wealthiest bootlegger killed his own wife while pursuing his own brand of justice.
The year was 1920, and the Prohibition Act had come into effect in the United States of America. The sale, production, and consumption of alcohol were completely banned. But in Cincinnati, a German-American lawyer working in a small law office, George Remus, realized that this ban was actually a tremendous opportunity for him. This intelligent 40-year-old man knew every word of the law by heart and decided to use this knowledge to become America's biggest bootlegger. Remus's plan was perfect. First, he would legally purchase liquor distilleries, then sell liquor from these distilleries to his own companies, and finally put this liquor on the market by making it appear stolen. On paper, everything was legal. In reality, he was conducting millions of dollars worth of liquor smuggling. In his magnificent mansion in Mount Adams, Cincinnati's wealthy district, George Remus lived like a true king. The parties held under crystal chandeliers hosted the city's most distinguished people. He attracted attention with his golden tuxedos, silk ties, and sparkling diamond rings on his fingers. He was earning $100,000 a day, an astronomical figure for that time. In late 1920, the woman who would enter Remus's life would completely change his fate. Imogene Holmes was a 35-year-old, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and extremely attractive woman from St. Louis. She had been married before, divorced from her husband, and was now trying to build a new life in Cincinnati. Imogene was not only beautiful, but also very intelligent and manipulative. When she met George Remus, she immediately noticed his power and wealth. The night they first met was at the ballroom of the Sinton Hotel in downtown Cincinnati. With jazz music playing, George Remus stood in his tuxedo, sipping his whiskey. When Imogene entered the hall in her emerald green long dress, all the men's heads turned, but that night, she was focused only on George Remus. "Mr. Remus, I've heard a lot about you," Imogene said, with a slight southern accent in her voice. "Are you really Cincinnati's most successful businessman?" George realized at that moment that this woman was different. "Madam, my success comes only from understanding the law well. The system works for you." After that night, a passionate relationship began between George and Imogene. 6 months later, in 1921, they married. Their wedding was the biggest event in Cincinnati society. The first years of their marriage were like a fairy tale. George bought Imogene the most beautiful gifts in the world, watched Broadway shows with her in New York, and dined at the most luxurious restaurants in Chicago. Imogene began to take an increasingly active role in her husband's business. Her intelligence and social skills greatly helped George expand his business network. But Imogene was also learning about the danger of her husband's work. Federal agents were constantly after Remus, especially a young and determined Franklin L. Dodge. This 30-year-old agent worked day and night to end Remus's operations. Dodge was a typical federal agent, tall, black-haired, dark blue-eyed, and with a determined gaze. He was assigned to Cincinnati in 1923, and his first target was George Remus. He followed Remus's operations, interrogated his men, and raided his distilleries. George spoke to Imogene about Dodge at home, with slight concern in his voice. "This man is different from the others, Imogene. He doesn't take bribes. He's not afraid of threats. He's really determined to catch me." Imogene listened carefully to her husband's words. "Maybe we need to talk to him, George. Maybe a deal can be made." George found his wife's suggestion reasonable. Maybe this agent could be silenced for money like the others. But George was unaware of his wife's real plans at the time. In early 1924, What George Remus feared happened to him. Federal agents arrested him for tax evasion and violating prohibition laws. The court process was long and exhausting. George decided to defend himself. After all, he was a lawyer and knew the law very well. But during the trial, Imogene's behavior began to change. Instead of supporting her husband in the courtroom, she frequently met with federal agents, giving them information. George initially thought these were innocent meetings. Perhaps his wife was trying to convince the agents to release him. The truth would be much more painful. In 1925, George Remus was sentenced to 2 years in prison and sent to Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. The prison was a gloomy place, surrounded by high walls in George's oppressive heat. George almost completely lost contact with the outside world. In the first months, Imogene wrote letters regularly and came to visit. But over time, these letters became less frequent. Visits decreased. George couldn't understand why. Maybe his wife was busy running the business in his absence. Maybe she was under pressure from federal agents. But in mid-1926, one of George's prison friends brought him shocking news. "George, I have bad news for you. Your wife is living with that federal agent. With Dodge, they're stealing all your money too." George didn't want to believe this news when he first heard it, but the incoming reports showed how painful the truth was. Imogene, together with Franklin Dodge, was stealing George's entire fortune, assets worth millions of dollars, everything. Worse still, she had filed for divorce and wanted George's property transferred to her. George Remus, sitting in the cold cell of Atlanta Penitentiary, watched his life fall apart. His wife had betrayed him. His fortune was stolen, and worst of all, the person doing this was the woman who claimed to love him. Prison days had become complete torture for George Remus. Every night, lying in his bed, he thought about Imogene and Dodge being together, and his anger multiplied. He knew they were living a luxurious life with his money, living in his house, using his car. George shaped his plan while talking to other inmates in prison. "If a man is betrayed by his wife like this, what should he do?" he asked. An old inmate, Jimmy the Knife Morrison, told him, "George, there's a rule on the street. The person who betrays you has to pay the price. Otherwise, everyone will trample you underfoot." George constantly repeated these words in his head. Imogene had not only betrayed him, but also trampled on his honor. He couldn't let this go unpunished. In September 1927, George Remus was released from prison. The moment he had been planning for 2 years had finally come. When he returned to Cincinnati, the city felt completely foreign to him. His old friends began to distance themselves from him. Everyone was talking about his downfall and his wife's betrayal. George no longer lived in his old, magnificent mansion. Imogene had seized the house and evicted him from there. Now he lived in a modest apartment in the city's outskirts. But he had only one thing on his mind: revenge. George began to learn Imogene's daily routine. He followed where she went, who she met with, where she was at, what times. Imogene was now living with Franklin Dodge, and they had a social life in Cincinnati's wealthy circles. In early October, George received important news. Imogene would appear in court for the divorce case. This presented him with a perfect opportunity. He knew that on the court day Imogene would definitely be in downtown. George found an old double-barreled hunting shotgun from his old days. He cleaned it and prepared the shells. Looking at himself in the mirror, he saw that the old George Remus was just a memory. His hair had grayed, his face was filled with lines, and there was cold determination in his eyes. "Imogene, you know very well what you did to me," he murmured, looking in the mirror. "Now you're going to pay the price." October 6, 1927, Thursday, was a beautiful autumn morning in Cincinnati. The leaves created a colorful landscape in yellow and red tones. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the divorce case would begin at Hamilton County Court. George Remus woke up early in the morning. He dressed carefully, black suit, white shirt, black tie. He hid the shotgun inside a long bag. He looked at himself in the mirror one last time. Today, George Remus will deliver justice. he said to himself. Imogene was having breakfast with Franklin Dodge that morning. They were unaware that George had been released. Dodge was reassuring Imogene. "Don't worry, George can't harm us anymore. We have everything legally." At 10:30, the court took a break. Imogene walked toward the car parked near Eden Park. In her blue coat and elegant hat, she maintained her beauty in her 30s. She suspected nothing. George Remus was waiting among the sycamore trees of Eden Park. The shotgun was hidden under his coat. When he saw Imogene walking toward her car, his heart began to beat rapidly. The moment he had been planning for 2 years had finally come. As Imogene took out her car keys, she heard footsteps behind her. When she turned around, she saw George. At first she was surprised, then scared. The expression on George's face told her a lot. "George, what are you doing here?" she asked, trembling in her voice. "Imogene, I need to talk to you," said George, with cold determination in his voice. "We can't talk here, George. I need to go back to court." "No, Imogene, we need to talk now." When Imogene noticed the shotgun in George's hand, she wanted to scream. But George approached her and whispered, "You destroyed me, Imogene. You stole my life, my honor, everything. Now you're going to pay the price. George, please, I still love you. I can explain everything." "Too late, Imogene. Too late." George raised the shotgun. Imogene tried to run one last time, but George pulled the trigger. The explosion sound broke the silence of Eden Park. Imogene fell to the ground. George approached her and looked at her one last time. "George Remus killed Imogene Remus," he said to himself. "Justice has been served." George Remus waited for the police to arrive. He put the shotgun on the ground and raised his hands. A few minutes later, police cars and an ambulance arrived. Imogene had died at the scene. When George was arrested, he only told the police, "I am George Remus. George Remus killed Imogene Remus. The reason for this is that she killed George Remus." The court process became one of America's most interesting murder trials. George Remus decided to defend himself. When he told his story to the jury, he referred to himself in the third person. "Honorable jury members," said George, standing up in the courtroom. "George Remus is both the defendant and the lawyer in this case. George Remus will explain to you how he was killed. In the story he will tell you." The jury members were surprised when they encountered this strange defense style. But as George told his story, he saw the changing expressions on their faces. When he told about Imogene's betrayal, the theft of his fortune, and his honor being trampled underfoot, he saw understanding in the jury members' eyes. "George Remus was killed by his wife," he continued. "Not physically, but spiritually, honorably. When Imogene Remus killed George Remus, it became inevitable for George Remus to kill her too." The court process lasted 6 weeks. George Remus was so convincing in his defense that the jury members decided he had experienced a temporary state of insanity. On December 19, 1927, George Remus was acquitted. In the courtroom, after the verdict was announced, George stood up and thanked the jury members. "George Remus has regained his faith in justice," he said. When he left the courthouse, reporters were waiting for him. He spoke his final words to them. "George Remus is no longer the old George Remus, but George Remus knows that justice has been served." After his acquittal, George Remus left Cincinnati. He spent the rest of his life quietly and modestly. He never married again, never got into big business again. In 1952, at the age of 78, he died of natural causes.
George Remus's story is not just a tale of revenge, but also a mirror showing the dark side of 1920s America. The Prohibition era was a time when bad things became even more attractive, when money and power poisoned human relationships. The tragedy that Remus experienced is perhaps the most striking example of that period, a man being betrayed by the woman he loved and consequently implementing his own justice. This story reminds us how fragile trust is and how destructive revenge can be. In the end, did George Remus find justice, or did he just kill his own soul? The answer to this question may be hidden in each of our own consciences.